So, just a bit of an introduction. First, I want to say good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for attending the TCA Environmental Committee seminar on environmental law developments impacting the construction industry. We are delighted to welcome our speakers today, Talia Gordner, partner McMillan LLP, and Annik Forristal, co-group head of McMillan LLP's National Infrastructure and Construction Group. Today's session will provide insights into significant legal developments and trends affecting the construction industry. So please feel free to submit any questions you may have during the session using the Q&A box on the screen. And we hope you find this session both informative and beneficial. And thank you all again and welcome for joining us. And over to you, Annik. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Deshawn, and thank you to the TCA for hosting us today. As Deshawn said, I'm a co-group head of McMillan's National Infrastructure and Construction Group. My practice really focuses on front-end permitting and construction contracts, so really focused on what you need to get your shovel in the ground. My partner, Talia Gordner, specializes in environmental law, and we work very closely together on environmental matters that arise of all variety on construction projects. So what are we going to talk to you about today? On the agenda, and it's a tight one for the next hour, and we will be keeping an eye on the chat throughout the presentation for any questions that might come in. If we can work them into the presentation, we will. Otherwise, we will address them at the end and leave some time for that. To get started, Talia will speak to us about the Federal Plastics Registry. We'll then take some time to talk about the new Ontario Building Code. We'll then talk about the PFAS regulations and reporting requirements, greenwashing and laws impacting surrounding that. And then we'll very briefly just mention some other laws impacting construction, some developments that are still underway. But in the interest of time and without further ado, I will pass it over to Talia to get started on the Federal Plastics Registry.
Thanks so much, Annik. So we're going to start really with taking a step back in terms of plastics regulation in Canada, because I think it's useful for context, because this is really the first instance of plastics being regulated in the construction industry. So for a lot of people in the industry, it feels like it came out of nowhere. So I kind of thought it was useful to level set on where this comes from. So this new federal plastics registry, which we'll be talking about, arises from a Canada-wide strategy on zero plastic waste issued by the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment. So each province, territory, and the federal government all have a Ministry of Environment. They got together in November 2018 and put together this strategy. So it's focused on reducing plastic pollution, creating economic opportunities to recover the value of used plastics, and of course, achieving Canada's goal of zero plastic waste. So this goal is aspirational. It's not legally mandated, but it does inform increasing regulation in the space of plastics. So there's a few regulations and proposals arising from these federal action plans, which are intended to carry out this objective. The first is a federal single-use plastics ban. This has been enacted. That's why there's no plastic grocery checkout bags anymore, or plastic straws or stir sticks. That's more focused on particularly consumer goods, but that's been in effect for some time now. The Federal Plastics Registry, which of course has now been issued. There's also regulations to come on recycled content and labeling rules for plastics, as well as what we call a P2 notice with respect to primary food packaging for grocery stores. So not something you guys have to worry about. But I wanted to kind of get a sense of this is coming from a number of different angles, and it's all arising from this federal action plan. So the Federal Plastics Registry, this is a legislative instrument called a notice under Section 46(1) of the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. It gives it authority to mandate reporting of information related to the regulation of the environment. So this is how the Federal Plastics Registry was created, and what the government's doing. And I apologize, I'm nursing a bit of a cold, so bear with me. The government's doing is they're collecting information on plastics that are placed in the market, that are collected for diversion, that are successfully reused, repaired, remanufactured, refurbished, recycled, if they're incinerated for energy recovery, if they're imported or if they're exported. They're trying to figure out plastics, how they get into Canada, whether through manufacturing or through import, and then where they're ending up at their end of life. And the purpose of this is to collect future information for potentially future regulation, as well as to measure our effectiveness at meeting our action plan objectives on a national scale as well as a global scale. So, what are the reporting obligations? So, there's a number of categories of types of plastics that are subject to reporting. I've highlighted in red here kind of the key ones we're going to focus on today, but it covers plastic resins. So that's really the core plastic material that's being manufactured, plastic packaging, electronics and electrical equipment, or triple E, tires, transportation plastics, so think of vehicles, mobility aids, construction plastics, agriculture and horticulture, fishing and aquaculture plastics, apparel and textiles, and then a few categories of single-use or disposable plastics. So the particular categories I think are useful to understand in the construction industry is, of course, the three I've highlighted here. Plastic packaging, this category covers any kind of packaging used for transport, shipping. So it may be that you purchase a product off the shelf and it comes encased in some form of plastic, or there's plastic in the packaging. That counts. If you're buying a pallet of products and they come wrapped, maybe they have like a wrap, a plastic wrap around them to hold them on the pallet, that's plastic packaging. So whether it's for shipping, packaging, transport, if it's just material that's intended to protect or ease transport or shipping, that counts as plastic packaging. So maybe you are not in the business of plastic packaging, but the odds that you're not using it at all is pretty rare because it's often used kind of to cushion products that are being shipped or transported. The triple E category contains really a huge, vast variety of information technology and technical electronics and electric equipment. So IT and telecommunications devices and equipment, audio, visual, and consumer equipment and media. We've listed a lot of these here, but some of the things I think show up a lot in the construction industry would be lighting, chargers, monitoring control instruments for fire suppression, for heating and cooling, those kind of things. Power tools, a lot of electronic tools. If you have speaker systems through the building, for example, that's all going to get covered. And any accessories that go with this stuff. So there's a lot of things in that space that end up being captured. The construction category, of course, is the more obvious one, but I wanted to make sure we didn't miss these other two that I think will actually engage the construction industry quite a bit. So they have different categories. There's general categories and then subcategories, and these are all defined in the notice, but their categories include windows and doors, interior finishes, construction film and sheeting, insulation materials, paints and coatings, piping and fittings, roofing materials, siding and cladding, and decking and fencing. So ends up covering pretty much anything in most instances that have plastic in them. So you really need to look at, and we'll talk about when you'd have to report and who would have to report, but really start thinking through where plastic is showing up in your products, in your operations. So who has to report? There's three categories of reporters. There are producers of these subject materials we talked about. This is a defined term, so it depends on your supply chain who is going to be the producer of a particular product. So maybe the manufacturer, the importer, the brand owner, the distributor, the supplier. It will depend on the supply chain. But a company may be defined as a producer for some of its products and not others. For example, if you are sourcing a widget, let's just say, if you're sourcing it from the US and you are the first importer and that company doesn't have any other operations in Canada, you would be the producer. Where if you're sourcing it from a Canadian company, you may not necessarily be the producer. They're really focused on the brand owner, whose product is it and who owns the brand. But it goes through a if not this, then analysis. So it's really specific to the product and its supply chain. So it's not we buy all our stuff from the US, so I guess we're always the importer. It will depend on if the brand owner has some presence in Canada. So it's actually a much more nuanced analysis. We work with a lot of clients to help them understand and go through their supply chain and figure out where they have to report and what they don't. There's also generators of packaging and plastic product waste. So as you're unwrapping things that have plastic in them, and whether it's from packaging or offcuts from products or products that don't meet spec, if there's plastic of any kind going into your waste stream and you are generating that, then you are a generator of plastic waste. So most project sites will have a big dumpster that has a bunch of plastic stuff going into it. That's the category of generation. Um, One of the things I want to just flag here is in the construction industry, it's most things are thought of from a project to project perspective, right? What are we doing at this project? What are we doing at that project? We only generate this much packaging at this project versus this much plastic waste at that project. That's not how this regulation works. This regulation is going at a company level. So it is all of your projects that we're looking at. It's not, I only imported this amount or these types of products. I didn't import any plastic for project A, but I did import some plastic products for project B. Um, it's across all of your projects, what you're importing, what kind of resins, what kind of plastics. So it's really important to be mindful of that and to kind of reset your thinking to a company level. There's also service providers. So the companies that are supporting the construction industry and are managing plastic waste, that might be recycling plastic waste, they might be collecting it, they might be processing it, they might be disposing of it. They're also required to report because that gives that full circle of where the plastics are, how they're getting into Canada or how they're being created within Canada, and then where they end up at their end of life. Are they being landfilled? Are they being recycled? In most of your instances, minus the packaging and offcuts, they're going into a building that's going to sit there for hopefully well over 100 years. So um, there might not be much to report on end of life, but I think it's important to just be aware that if you're a provider of services for management of waste at a project site, you are going to have to report as well. There is an exemption for small businesses. That's where in each of these categories, your total amount of plastic falls below 1,000 kilograms, which why it is important to not think of this as a per project basis, but at a company level. So it will really just depend year to year if you're going to meet that requirement, but you have to look at it as a whole. It's not separated by construction packaging, plastic packaging. Um, those other categories we talked about on the previous slide, it's all of the plastics that are considered produced by a producer in the producer category. So when do you have to report? For the 2024 calendar year, the reporting deadline September 29th for resins, if you're making any resins, which I don't think is happening much in this industry, plastic packaging, single-use disposable products, and triple E. For the construction category and the remaining categories, that you only have to start reporting for the 2025 and 2026 calendar year. So for most companies, the packaging is what dings them in 2024 if you're not importing or manufacturing any or distributing or selling any electronics, but the packaging always gets you for 2024. Everything else would be 2025, 2026. And then the report is the following year on September 29th. So just in terms of reporting and some key takeaways, the first reporting period is over, so it's really important. You have less than 9 months to determine if your products are subject to registry reporting requirements and if you're required to report. You need to start gathering data on your obligated plastics used and supplied because you have to determine what kind of resin and in what the quantities you're measuring are by weight. So you need to understand what your products have in them, what kind of plastic they have, and where they're being supplied to, which might be a little easier because it's projects are physical locations, but also in what quantities. And that usually requires some legal support to understand, when you're required to report, as we talked about. It's really specific to your supply chain. So getting a handle on where plastic shows up in your supply chain, then having a conversation with legal about what you are and aren't required to report and what data you have to gather is important because you need to start working on that. It takes a lot longer than you think it will. We have some guidance from Environment Canada. It's limited. And we've also written on this topic a lot. So we have a more general bulletin about the plastics registry, and we also have one that's more targeted to the construction industry as well, which you're welcome to read. You can just Google my name or Annik and plastics, and you'll probably find what you're looking for. So that's plastics. And I'll hand it over to Annik to talk about the new Ontario Building Code.
Okay, great. Yeah, and I have been monitoring the chat, and I did not see any questions come in on that topic. So we will jump right into the building code. I'm going to start by giving just a little bit of an overview of the history of the National Building Code, just to give some context to the process that we find ourselves in, including here in Ontario for our new building code. So the first National Building Code was published by the National Research Council, the NRC, in 1941. The Canadian Commission on Building and Fire Codes was then established about 50 years later in 1991 to update and maintain the National Building Code, including by developing what are called national model codes. The federal government announced a new governance model for the development of these national model codes, which became effective in 2022. So on the next slide, just kind of illustrates a little bit of the that new governance model. So we have the Canadian Board for Harmonized Construction Codes, and that is comprised of representatives from all of the provinces and territories, as well as the federal public services. In particular, the NRC sits in the role of the federal government on that committee, and they develop, approve, and maintain the national model codes based on strategic priorities, which are established by the Canadian Table for Harmonized Construction Codes policy. And really, like the focus of these bodies is on doing their best to establish codes that could be used across the country, to help provide for some standardization and harmonization. Next slide, please. So the national model codes currently get updated every 5 years. It's a consensus-based process, so it does have those representatives on the committees from all of the provinces, but they also engage code users like chief building officials and others in the other organizations within the sector, as well as the public. So currently, right now, the 2025 national model codes are being prepared, and we're anticipating 7 public reviews of the 2020 national model codes. So there have been 4 of those to date, with the most recent ending last month on December 19th. We are anticipating another 2 to be held this year, with the objective being that the 2025 national model codes will be issued sometime later this year. So next slide, please. So how does this affect or relate to Ontario? Well, the provinces and territories are required to specifically adopt the NBC, the National Building Code, and national model codes for them to become law. So the provinces, like Ontario, are not statutorily, for example, required to do so. But the province of Ontario and other provinces have signed on to an agreement called the Reconciliation Agreement on Construction Codes. And in this reconciliation agreement, they established terms for harmonization of the provincial building codes with the national model codes. The provinces like Ontario, however, are permitted to adopt jurisdiction-specific variations or exceptions to that, but they are trying to minimize those variations as much as possible. So the new building code, next slide, please, that we that came into effect on January 1st of this year is the 2024 Ontario Building Code, and it is implementing the 2020 national model codes. So those national model codes were issued in 2022, and under the reconciliation agreement, the province of Ontario agreed to update their building code within 2 years of that, for harmonization with those 2020 national codes. So we now have, oh, sorry, if you want to go back.
Right.
So we now have the 2024 Ontario Building Code that came into effect on January 1st. Now, up until December 31st of last year, you were able to submit a building permit application on the basis of the 2012 code. However, as of January 1st and going forward, you are now required, all building permit applications will be required to comply with the 2024 building code, unless the only exception to this is between now and March 31st of this year, If you have your architect or engineer and they agree and they've determined that your plans were substantially complete as of December 31st of last year, if that is the case, then you may still submit until March 31st a building permit application on the basis of the 2012 code. After that, as of April 1st of this year, no matter what, no matter when your plans were complete, no matter how far along your designs may be, um, all applications for a building permit will need to comply with the 2024 building code as of April 1st. And this is significant because the changes to the 2024 building code are significant and have a direct impact on the construction cost of these projects. So we are talking to owners who are recognizing that if they were not able to fall within this transition period, then they're going to have to go back, get their plans updated at a significant cost, but also the cost of building to those new standards is increased. Just noting that construction also needs to start within 6 months of permit issuance, otherwise it could be revoked. So if you do fall within that transition, or if you did get your building permit on the 2012, on the basis of the 2012 code last year, start your construction. Recommend having a building inspector come to confirm, just so that that permit on the basis of the old code is not at risk. So, as noted, there are some pretty significant changes under the 2024 building code. We are not going to be getting into the technical details, although do note that, for example, Canadian Consulting Engineer is hosting a webinar on February 6th where they're going to be running through the technical changes. But these changes focus on housing supply, health and safety, cost, even though the cost of building under it is increased for the most part, but also better buildings. And you might be asking, well, why is this in a presentation about environmental laws and how they impact the construction industry? And that is because, if you go to the next slide, please, a lot of the conversations that are happening during the consultations for at the national level, the national model codes, and that are ongoing now as we look to prepare the 2025 national model codes, are really focused on climate change and talking about how do we address the problems due to climate change and their impacts to infrastructure. Because what we're recognizing is, and we're trying to balance the interests in more extreme weather events, higher winds, more extreme temperature swings. All of these things have an impact directly on our infrastructure, on our buildings. And so can we build them differently now going forward to help reduce the long-term costs of damage to these structures or their failure over a shorter period of time because of their exposure to extreme climate? And so if you go to the next slide, please. What are we facing right now as a result of this? Well, we're facing some uncertainty in this transition period. I think, unfortunately, a lot of people are going to have to go back and redesign to the 2024 code, and that might end up or result in certain projects being put on hold or not being able to go forward just due to the cost implications of that. There's also some uncertainty as to how you prove, like if you do fall within that exception, your plans were substantially complete as of December 31st. How do you prove that? What is the municipality, what is the chief building official going to require from you and your architect or engineer to establish that you fall within that transition provision? And then what do you do if they disagree with you? The options there are not always ideal and can be limited. There's also more consultation taking place. Sorry, I'm almost done, Talia.
No, sorry. I thought it was a natural pause and I was trying to flow with you, but I'm ahead.
It's all good. There's more consultation ongoing. And so that is where, there are decisions being made about what's going to happen in the 2025 National Building Code. And under that reconciliation agreement, Ontario has agreed that within a year and a half of that being issued, so by 2027, we'll be updating our building code for harmonization with that as well. So the conversations that are happening right now at the national level will directly affect what's taking place and what will happen in the future for our building code. And so, there's been a lot of change in the code over the last few years, as we note here, more changes coming, and a lot of that is environmentally motivated. And so that is the reason why we've included it here in today's presentation.
And it's very helpful because I think a lot of this stuff gets buried in these bigger issues of building code updates and not, um, why they're doing it. And it does kind of inform and give you some insight into what the regulators or the legislators are thinking about when they're looking to update these standards and
Yeah.
codes.
No, and to your point, Talia, like there's a lot of lobbying and a lot of differing views on how we should do this. So, for example, hurricane clips and hold down straps for rooftops, should that be mandated by the building code? It's not currently included in the 2024 building code, in part because of lobbying and a lot of people in the industry's position that that would increase and negatively affect the affordability of homes, for example. So there's a lot of competing interests, a lot of interesting conversations happening, and so strongly recommend people get involved.
So now we're going to talk about PFAS reporting because I couldn't make you guys listen to two environmental reporting requirements back to back. So there is, you've probably seen this in a lot of headlines, often called forever chemicals, um, PFAS, which is per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, what it stands for. It actually is a category and type of substance that makes up about a family of about a few thousand man-made chemicals. Um, they're developed for use in all sorts of uh, uses for household, commercial, industrial. They're really known for their stain resistant, water repellent qualities. So they show up, unfortunately for us, in a lot of food packaging and takeout containers, firefighting foam, stain resistant furniture and rugs, nonstick cookware, all sorts of things. Um, the stuff that makes the most headlines, of course, is the stuff that comes into contact with individuals. But we'll talk a little bit about where else it shows up. So they're called forever chemicals because they have a really slow rate of breakdown in the environment, and they also, once they get into our bloodstream, they stay there. So there's increasing intention and research being done on the impacts to human health as a result of this exposure to these chemicals that are really just like in your everyday products. So where we see PFAS in construction materials, this is not an exclusive list, um, but often in stone, tile, grout, and concrete sealant, electronics, roofing materials, waterproofing materials, paints, coatings, lacquers, all those really great features, being stain resistant, being water repellent, are the same features that the chemical compound that makes it so good is also, why it's a problem. Tapes and adhesive floor materials, including rugs. So when you're thinking about building a building, you may say, well, we don't really use textiles, but if you're doing flooring, you are, right? A lot of times these rugs are built in, they're part of the construction and the design. Furniture and textiles, as I mentioned, and composite wood products as well. So some high level, you can do some Googling and we can have some conversations about, the specific products you're using. And if they're in there, a lot of times that requires some conversations with suppliers. But um, a lot of the focus and headlines, as I said, you'll see is on consumer products, but that's not where it's limited. It's really in so many different industries, so many different categories of products because it does all these really fantastic things that make it something that was worth putting into all these products. The features are pretty fantastic if they didn't have environmental or health consequences. Um, so we have very limited regulation right now in Canada on PFAS. They've targeted, excuse me, a few key chemicals and they're phased out or limited in some ways, but they've been completing studies and assessing risk management and working on pending new regulations. So there is regulations to come. They intend to regulate PFAS as a class as opposed to each of these individual several thousand products. We don't have a copy of the draft regulations yet, so we don't know exactly what's going to look like, but we're assuming there's going to be some exceptions or different phase out periods depending on use in industry and if there's alternative products, but we won't know with certainty. There's also some regulations for drinking water standards and contaminated sites standards when we're talking about remediation or management or risk assessment or getting records of site condition for these projects. So PFAS is also being considered, but it's not in every single set of standards. So just something to be aware of, particularly if you are not just doing business in Ontario, that this is something that's being looked at more by environmental consultants and by the regulators as well. So when you're dealing with developing a site where there is the operations involve PFAS and there's potential contamination from it, it might be something that you'll still have to look at, even if it's not necessarily in the main standard, but it might be in the drinking water standard, even if it's not a drinking water site, because there's increasing regulation of PFAS. So it's just something to be aware of from the contaminated site standpoint. So there's a new reporting requirement that is due in a week. So it requires reporting on PFAS by manufacturers, importers, and users of PFAS in the calendar year of 2023. You can request an extension, but you've got to get it in before the 29th. So people have to move really quickly. We're helping with those extension requests where needed, but it does require an explanation for why you need more time and what you've been doing to meet the requirements. So just something to be mindful of. But they've been pretty generous about granting them once you meet those requirements, and they're granting about a 6 months to file your reports. So uh, there's there is increasing regulation of PFAS substances in Canada to align with existing developing regulation in the US and Europe, who's always ahead on environmental issues. But it's really important to be mindful of where PFAS is showing up in your supply chain, in your products, just because there's increasing regulation coming. So rather than scrambling after the fact to figure out where it is when there's already regulation, then you're on the clock, is to know in advance. So this reporting requirement is really useful also for having the regulator get a better understanding of where PFAS is showing up in your industry, because they'll likely be taken into account as they're finalizing these regulations. It does take time to figure out where it is. You have to contact your suppliers a lot of the time. You don't know, you're importing the product, you don't make it. So the sooner you begin that investigation, assessment, and risk process, the better. And you should expect increasing attention. So if you have some product you are always using, some particular paints, particular coating that has certain features that is integral to your business, you need to know if there's PFAS in that, because you might need to start planning for alternatives or staying hyper aware of what regulations coming into place, because you may have to phase it out and you may have to start looking for alternatives, or it may not no longer be available. I don't know for your specific products. We don't have the regulations, but it's useful to know so you can actually plan and you don't get caught not being able to use something or having to scramble to find an alternative. So these are the kind of things to think about. We might be talking years down the road, but it's useful to really get a handle on this. And this reporting requirement is a good way to kind of trigger you to actually consider this. So if you are importing products that contain PFAS or PFAS substances themselves, usually they're in some sort of solvent mixture product, or they are already within a manufactured item that you are importing. If you are actually manufacturing things that contain PFAS, or if you are adding PFAS in manufacturing, those are the instances where and so for for construction, it's kind of interesting, because if you're applying, let's say, a paint that contains PFAS to a building or to a product within a building, that would be for the purpose that's considered manufacturing, because you're adding it to this product. This product now has PFAS on it, and that's what the government's trying to get information on. So it's important to kind of think through the supply chain and where the stuff is showing up, how it gets into Canada, where it's coming from, and then how it's being used in your operations. So it's not so different from some of the information you're gathering from the Federal Plastics Registry, but it's just different. It just applies and shows up in different ways. Plastic's a little easier to find. PFAS requires a little more nuance, because we don't always know it's actually in the product or been applied to a part or something before you bring it into the country or you start using it.
Talia, to that point, one of the questions we've received, and you gave us a list of examples of where we might find PFAS in construction materials, and that included stone, tile, grout, concrete sealant, which is what this question was focused on. But I think the question really is relevant to any of those things that you listed, roofing materials, paints, coatings. How do we know what products have that? Like, their question was, what stones, tiles, sealants have PFAS? And I think, as you're saying, it's not a
Oh, it's not easy to
clear-cut
find.
answer. Yeah,
No,
so
I think
how do they figure that out?
so. One is looking at the safety data sheets. You should know that PFAS substances, there's a lot of them, as I said. They also will often go by different names, so it's worth really cross-checking with the chemicals that show up in the safety data sheets. A lot of times there'll be really limited information, or it's in the old safety data sheet, or the product itself wouldn't necessarily require a safety data sheet. So you're going to have to reach out to your suppliers and ask them if there's any of these kind of compounds in their products. There's not really another way to know. You can send something to a lab. Um, they can't always identify the specific PFAS compound, but they might be able to confirm if there's generally per or polyfluoroalkyl substances in them. But it's not often going to be just like on the back of the packaging. Like sometimes you'll get lucky and it'll be there, but usually not so much. Which is why spending the time now and getting a handle and starting that investigation early and getting your extension if you need to report is really important.
And while I, was originally thinking we could hold this till the end, but I think it relates to the same thing. Like, the other question that we received was, what steps should a general contractor take to comply with the plastics requirements? And I think, just like you're talking about with PFAS here, it really first starts with taking into account where your projects and the materials that you're working with, that you're having supplied, that you're installing, the waste that's generated from that falls within those categories. But Talia, what would you say for a general contractor? What's the first step that they should take to determine what their obligations are here?
Well, and I think the general contractor role is interesting because usually it's not the general contractor, to my knowledge, you correct me if I'm wrong, Annik, that's actually importing or buying the actual products. It's usually subs that are doing the actual service work and they're buying the products they need to do that work. But it might be different for different types of projects. So for your general contractor, you need to look at what what you're buying, what you're generating at your site, who owns or is the operator at the site where officially that is generating the plastic waste. If
And that
you're
might very well be them in most instances, because they'd be hiring all of the subs to supply everything, and often the general contractor is the one that's responsible for that, making sure that those bins are there for the waste disposal. But then they're
Yeah,
probably not necessarily the one actually doing the disposal.
well, and that's the service provider category, right? So while the general contractor, if they're the main operator at the site, they're going to be the one responsible for waste generation, be the party ultimately responsible for plastic waste generator reporting. The service providers they hire, they have their own reporting obligations separate from yours. If the general contractor isn't really the one purchasing or buying any or importing any products that may contain plastic for the purpose of the construction projects, their subs are doing that, then you wouldn't have reporting obligations as a producer. We also got asked a question last time, which I thought was really interesting and kind of speaks to the different mindset. Is somebody said, well, we produce our buildings. And I said, well, that's not this is a defined legal definition of a producer. We're talking about how your role in the supply chain and what is coming into the country or um, what you're supplying into the marketplace. So in a lot of instances, if you're getting a product that has plastic in it from a Canadian supplier, you're not going to have to report. If you're bringing it in, and that company has no footprint in Canada, that you're the brand owner of who you're buying it from, then you wouldn't have to report. That secondary piece of your plastic waste generator at your facilities is where you end up getting caught a lot of the time where you wouldn't otherwise necessarily have to report. It's a completely separate category.
And the other question that just came in was, what responsibility, if any, does the actual like project owner, the client of the general contractor, the person who's hiring everyone, the GC and everyone to actually get that building or whatever it may be constructed, where would
I
they
think
fall into this?
I'm not sure in most instances they are going to fall into the a reporting obligation because they're not really in the industry. Um, and they're not the ones really engaging with this. They're just the owner that are paying the bills, which the environmental regulators do not care about. So if for some reason the owner has a connection with the general contractor, or if it's an affiliated company or something like that, then they might have some obligations. But I think on average, the owner is not usually going to have any obligations. It's really where this stuff is showing up in the construction industry more so.
I think that actually transitions really nicely to this this slide, which is, when we're talking about all of these requirements, everything we've just been talking about. So PFAS, the Federal Plastics Registry, changes to the building code. What are the contract implications? Well, as Talia just said, these reporting obligations and all of the work that you'll have to do to just figure out what applies, let alone the time it will take to measure, record, get the data you need to fulfill your obligations. Here is the volume, weight of plastics that was generated across all of my projects for 2024. And the cost associated with reporting that. These are all overhead costs that will not really be directly recoverable under your contracts. So in the same way that you have to account for other overhead costs for running your business, your staff, etc., um, these will have to become costs that you account for in that way. Because they're not really going to turn into a line item in a cost of the work, for example. So it's unlikely that as these new obligations are being imposed on your businesses starting, this year and on construction products, for example, for the Federal Plastics Registry next year, you have to be mindful about what those are, even though I appreciate it, it can be hard to know at this point in time. And then just like with other overhead and management costs, do your best to recover it, because not seeing that being likely in a direct, contract price cost of the work situation. Do want to flag that where there are changes in laws that require modification to the contract documents, or for a subcontract, TCA1 subcontract documents, stipulated price, so like fixed price standard form contracts like the CCDC2, CCA1, if they haven't been amended by supplementary conditions, they do provide for adjustment to the pricing when that has happened after bid closing. But again, with the runway that these laws have had, like, so for example, with the building code, I appreciate you're not the designer, and I do think this will have more of an impact on them and revising those. But if for whatever reason changes are coming through to the contract documents that you were working on because of building code changes, there could be opportunity there if that occurs after bid closing, to seek relief under your contracts. But unfortunately for the Federal Plastic Registry, PFAS, these other reporting requirements, because they're not direct project costs, we anticipate this being more challenging for you as a GC, for example, to recover directly.
Yeah, I think you really have to think of it as a business cost in the same way you have the cost to file taxes, you have to comply with your OSHA requirements,
Yep.
just day to day. It's the same kind of thing, right? It's a cost of doing business and it is an overhead cost, and it's useful to set aside some resources to deal with this and respond to it. And it's just not project by project, so there's not really a way to pass it off. It's it's what plastics you're bringing in, and it's only reporting, right? There's no payment. So it's just the resources, your internal resources for complying, um, as opposed to having to there being actual cost. If I import this product, I have to pay this amount of money. That's not the case. There are also environmental consultants. You're usually dealing with them in the context of contaminated sites issues, but they also do provide support on the more technical aspect of helping you prepare these reports if that's needed, where our focus is a lot more on where you're required to comply and what you're required to report and deal with. But you can always get a third party to help if you're a little overwhelmed with it internally. So that takes us to greenwashing. So, what is greenwashing? Um, it has different definitions for different purposes, but generally, it's an environmental claim about a product, a service, or a company. It may imply particular features or characteristics. It may exaggerate positive benefits or play down their negative impact. Um, you may use complex terms or terms that have an opaque meaning where they might take from it that something is particularly good for the environment, better for the environment, or just generally green or sustainable. Um, they may imply or state that some sort of endorsement or something doesn't exist, and they might not be able to actually be substantiated. So that's where you're going to see greenwashing. It's not greenwashing if it's all true. Um, so examples you often see will be things like something is eco-friendly or better for the environment or environmentally safe, sustainable, green. They might have a program affiliation or some sort of certification. Sometimes there's material identification or coding systems that are used. They might use graphics like the little, I don't know if you guys know this, the little recycling chasing arrow symbol is called the Mobius loop, um, which I only learned once I became an environmental lawyer and refer to it more than anyone should. Um, so these are kind of things where you might see greenwashing. It doesn't mean these things can't be true, but you need to really be cautious about them. And that's because there's increasing regulation of greenwashing. So I've listed some legislation here. It's of course happening in the UK, in the US, in the EU as well. But most of our regulation is happening either on the consumer protection side and under the Competition Act on a more general level. So there's been recent amendments to the Competition Act. There was always provisions that you can't make false or misleading claims that did cover greenwashing claims, but they've added additional requirements requiring you to actually do adequate and proper testing or substantiation to confirm the claims you're making, the about a product's environmental benefits or the environmental benefits or activity of a business are actually are actually substantiated. And you need to do this verification before you've made a green claim. So if you say our products are sustainable, you should have already done adequate and proper testing, generally by a third party independent company that's in a position to actually assess that and do that test with internationally recognized methodology to confirm they are sustainable based on some metric that's verifiable and widely accepted in the industry before you make your claim that it's sustainable. Um, so we've written about this. We have a bulletin on it as well. There is some draft guidance that provides a little more support as well in addition to our bulletin. But what's really important here is you're seeing this stuff everywhere, right? Like you'll see like this contains 40% more recyclable material. And I'm the misanthrope environmental lawyer who looks and goes 40% more than what? Than your previous version? Like, does that make this product more recyclable? Or because it doesn't have virgin patch plastic, does it actually make it less recyclable? So you can make these kind of claims or say we're environmentally friendly. How are you more environmentally friendly? What makes it? That's a really general kind of statement. It can even be just you're putting making something green and putting a bunch of trees on it and it kind of implies that it's more environmentally friendly. If the average consumer, whether it's in a commercial setting or in a public setting, views it as misleading, that's greenwashing. So this can happen at the corporate level as well as at the, we're not really dealing with consumer goods here, but you do have customers, you do have people buying stuff, you are putting information out into the world. And there is a real incentive to be a green company nowadays. So it's important to be aware that there are potential consequences for this. So when we're saying a building is green, we want to make sure that uh, the the metrics we're using, the standards we're using, the association that's providing the certification for that is trusted, reliable, is consistent, and it involves adequate and proper testing or substantiation to ensure that it's actually accurate before, as opposed to somewhere you just can pay and get a nice little green leaf rubber stamp, but doesn't actually have the same meaning. But the consumer, whether it's a commercial consumer or otherwise, would view it as something else. So it's really more important than ever to getting a good handle of looking through your uh, your systems and seeing where these kind of claims are showing up and making sure they've been verified. So who's responsible for actually verifying the claim and evaluating it? It's the company making the claim. So it might be the manufacturer, might be the distributor, might be the retailer. You might be selling the product as a distributor and saying, well, I was told by the manufacturer that has these green features. Well, then you've made an environmental claim. So now you need to make sure. So it's important if you're selling like we build green buildings or sustainable buildings, that's fine. And the basis for that is that you're relying on different inputs and components and features of the building that are supplied by subs. You need to make sure the stuff they're giving you is accurate because you are now making a claim yourself. That's really important. So there is increasing enforcement. Keurig got dinged for, dinged is a very generous word because it was a pretty significant fines and penalties for claiming for claiming their little coffee pods were recyclable when they in most instances were not. They may have technically been recyclable, but they weren't actually recyclable in the markets in which they're providing them because they didn't have the equipment and systems to recycle them. Volkswagen and Audi similarly had an issue for misleading statements on their emissions. Pathways Alliance is currently under investigations. They're in oil sands. Uh, a group of oil sand producers that are being investigated for statements they made about their plans to cut greenhouse gas emissions. So these are some bigger players, but anyone in the industry can make a complaint to the Competition Bureau. You can also bring a private action. So there's lots of opportunity to to increase enforcement either on a private level or through the regulator. So I've talked a lot about the practices to prevent greenwashing. Um, but sometimes, you can make those environmental claims, but you really want to make sure that where it requires more explanation that you provide it. So the example I gave, the plastic bottle says it's more recyclable. Say what it's more recyclable than, right? It's more recyclable than our previous product, which had this like these are the kind of things that you have to think about as you're saying this. Our product is sustainable when it's being used in this way and for this purpose, or in comparison to more sustainable, actually, instead of saying it's sustainable, it's more sustainable than our previous product or than the average product on the market because it has these features. That's how you protect yourself from a greenwashing claim. That might also mean you need to update your claims and update your statements as you increase your testing or new products become available on the market. There really needs to be a connection between marketing and sales and the engineers who are making and people who are actually making these products. Because a lot of times we'll say, here's this great product, here's what it uses for. This is, going to change the construction industry. And then sales takes it away and maybe expands. There's a little loosey-goosey with some of the language, and they've now committed greenwashing when you actually had these green features that were already verified, and they just went a little beyond, and now you've opened yourself up to a greenwashing claim where if you kind of kept it a little cleaner and made sure you complied and weren't doing anything that was slightly misleading, you wouldn't be in that place. Third-party organizations are really great for verifying those kind of claims as well. So something can't always do in-house, but there's definitely those services available.
Yeah, and to that point, Talia, I think a lot of the examples that are easier to come by are more product related. But, in the construction context, if you're going to say like we build greener, what does
Mhm.
that mean, right? Like is that because of the products you choose, and then are you choosing products that are actually making not greenwash statements themselves? Um,
What's
I
greener? What does greener
yeah.
mean? Is it just literally the color green, or is it more sustainable? Are you using more recycled material? Um, are you generating less emissions through just the operation of the building when it's completed? You have to say those things. So you can make a statement like we make greener buildings, but you open yourself up to the risk of um, being subject to
Yeah.
to regulatory enforcement or from the public.
Yeah. So
Um,
any of those things, like sustainable construction, all of these things, like they sound great. They're the kind of things that owners like to see when you're responding to their RFP. But to Talia's point here, if you don't have the data, the information, the facts to back up why you're saying that, or to be clear about what you mean in when you're saying that, it could expose you to risk under the Competition Act and the related legislation.
so then just a couple last things to highlight before we move on, just because they're topical and we have you here. One is there's new amendments to the excess soil regulation. Annik and I write about the excess soil regulation, which is in constant flux, it appears. One of the things is the limit on landfilling from that was supposed to come into effect on January 1st, 2025, with a few more extreme exceptions, has been bumped to 2027. Um, if you are not engaged with or understand what your excess soil regulations are at your projects, this is the time to do it because it's already fully in effect and the regulator is showing up at various project sites and starting inspections and escalating it as well to full investigations and for the purpose of taking further enforcement action. So something to be aware of. You can send us an email after this if you want to sign up for our bulletins. We write on all these topics regularly. Um, the environmental group writes a lot, the construction group writes a lot, and when we have some synergy, we write together. So that happens quite frequently because environmental issues always come up. So Annik and I are always co-authoring all sorts of stuff in addition to presenting together. The other the other thing that's pending right now is Ministry of Environment proposed amendments to the record of site condition regime. The intention is to prohibit the submission of a record of site condition for filing when the RSC is solely based on a phase one. Our view is this is pretty much a waste of time and not very valuable because if you can file an RSC with based on only a phase one. It's really very little work. Um, but they're also what's more interesting is expansion of some exemptions for RSC filing requirements where a change of property use for an existing building on the lower levels. So we've written about this. There's still time. The I think there might still be time to make submissions in the comment period, but it's useful to keep an eye on it as well. So just two things to look out for. And then that takes us to Q&A. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, I'm keeping an eye out. I think the last question that we received, and I'll just confirm with Deshawn, but was if we could share our slide deck, and I think the answer to that is yes, that that a PDF of our slides will be circulated to or made available to participants, although I'm not sure if that's by email
Yeah, it would be by
or
email.
okay.
Okay. Yeah, we'll send you the slides afterwards, Fashawn, and you can circulate it to the people that want it.
Okay, sure. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I'm looking at the chat and the question box, but not seeing any further questions coming in. Maybe give that one more minute, but
Sure. I know it's a lot of information to take in, but there's increasing regulation happening in the environmental space or environmental issues like climate change are informing regulation like we're seeing with the building code standards. So um, it's really important to just get a handle on what's coming and what's in your products and where you're engaging with this stuff, right? The construction industry, I think, has kind of gone under the radar in terms of environmental for a long time, outside of just dealing with contaminated sites and redevelopment of brownfields. And but it's not going away, it's just going to increase. So it's useful to get a handle on where there's plastics, where there's PFAS, where there's chemical usage in your products so you know what's coming and are prepared and can be a little more nimble as regulation comes into effect.
yeah, so another question that's come in is there a spot to sign up for update emails and information? So we can include a link to where you can sign up for our mailing list for McMillan, and I'm sure TCA also has a mailing list for their own members' updates as well. So we'll be sure to have that circulated to participants. Other question, excess soil regulation, is that for manufacturing facilities as well?
No, it's for the movement of soil from one property to another. So when you're excavating soil, if you're planning on moving it to another site, that is then considered to be excess soil. And there is a whole bunch of regulations that come into effect in terms of testing it to make sure you're not moving contaminated soil to a less contaminated site. There are specific environmental standards. There is tracking and transport requirements from the project, the original project site, as well as for the reuse site where it's going to be finally placed. So it's really, if you are moving soil between properties in your projects, it's really important to be to consider if you are going to be regulated by the excess soil regulation, so you need to make sure you're actually compliant.
But a manufacturing facility is unlikely to be excavating soil and moving it around. And so we wouldn't expect the legislation to apply to a manufacturing facility's operations.
Right.
And not seeing any further questions coming in, I think we can wrap things up there. Thank you again very much for having us.
Okay, thank you all for attending today's session, and a special thanks again to you, Talia and Annik, for joining us and sharing your valuable insights. If you're interested in being a part of the TCA Environmental Committee, please feel free to reach out to me via email at vthompson@tcaconnect.com. Also, feel free to reach out if you have any further questions by the same email address. And we look forward to hosting you for future events. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having us.
Bye.
Bye.